I'd say definitely for a long time, you've been someone who is contributing to the public conversation about culture. And so, what are your goals, in the same vein moving forward? Like in rebooting this podcast, what's your vision for it? What are your goals? What are you aiming to share with the people?
Uh, I think that I'm at a place where I want to share some of my lessons and conclusions, because uh, I could go on indefinitely, learning more about kind of like niche topics in this overall field of wellness, women's issues, relationships, love, sex, personal empowerment, um, social conditioning and reconditioning, all of that. But I would like to spend time sharing with my listeners what I have learned, having now done thousands of interviews, because there are hundreds and hundreds online in the podcast. But as a journalist and a writer of nonfiction, I have done thousands, which I have, tape recorded. So a lot of them, have had to be anonymous. So I have learned a lot about our moment in history and how unique it is, how
Mm.
extremely, unusual it is. And I have a vision of how we can move forward, um, which I will make even more clear as I interact with an audience. You see, like, on my own, I have thought about it in depth for a long time now. But interacting with the audience will make it much more alive and
Mm.
real.
Mm. Yes. Thank you so much for sharing. Um, yeah, I think it's very important for people, especially people like yourself who have been, you're like a collector of wisdom since you have spoken with so many people and you've collected so much anecdotal data. That's very exciting to me. I really love the idea of, yeah, like this kind of like pulling upon your archival research, like maybe not so concretely, but just to share the things that you have collected, like like a highlight reel in a way of the lessons.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
excellent.
that's a good way to put it, the highlight reel. Like, let's talk about what's womanhood in
Mm-hmm.
2024, or in the 21st century. Let's talk about what manhood is, what has happened to sexuality, what has happened to procreation, what has happened to society, right? In this time of like post-patriarchy, when all of our roles that had been enforced on us are no longer so strictly enforced and defined,
Mm-hmm.
and can we, once we understand these issues, and there are many of them, better, kind of like from the outside looking in, once we understand the big picture, we can make choices that will prevent us from kind of like backlash, right? Because I feel that we're at the crossroads,
Mm-hmm.
um, and depending on what we decide as individuals and as social beings and as a collective, we can like really go backward, and go through another dark ages, or we can move forward in an evolutionary way, in a way that's transformative. So, do we use this kind of like science driven, technology driven, and, global capital driven developments for the better, for the betterment of humanity? Or
Mm.
do we use them for the further enslavement of humanity? and really it's like 50-50. It could go either way. And I feel that the forces of, darkness are always like creeping up and getting stronger. You gotta fight for actual change, because the powers that be will do anything to prevent change, right? Substantial change, not performative change, not the theatrics or the spectacle of right change, but fundamental change is something that meets a lot of resistance. So you need numbers. So to answer your original question, spreading the word is the most important thing to do right now, because you need the power of numbers.
Yes. Wow. Very well put. I love that. I have more questions. I'm just going to say them out loud just so I don't forget them. The first question that comes up for me is, I want to ask you how you would you mentioned that this is like a post-patriarchy, and it's so funny because I don't ever think about the world this way, but in a lot of material ways you would be correct. Like, it's not the patriarchal, like in terms of like the roles that people are able to hold in society, those are not along gender lines in the same way that they were 30 or 50 years ago. And then for the all of humanity, going back to the dawn of the creation of patriarchy before then. So I have a question about that. But then, so also I would ask you, how would you? Oh, and then I wanted to comment. I think that you're so right. Like, think about the lack of change, and it's like the performative change, and like the change of how society looks is always moving. It's always changing. But ever since humans have created a way to hoard wealth and disenfranchise some people while other people capitalize off their labor, ever since that's been a thing, that the way that power is funneled upward, that's the thing that doesn't change. It's like, okay, yeah, women can be CEOs now, but power is still always being funneled upward. Whoever's holding that position of power, it's still not equal. It's not an egalitarian society. And so I guess my question that I'd like for you to answer right now is, how would you define the forces of darkness that you mentioned? Like, what do you mean by that specifically?
Okay, let me backtrack for a second to
Yes.
what I said in the beginning, which was that we're at this unique, extraordinary time in history. So I'll give myself as an example. My mother was married a virgin, of course, at 18 to the man who asked for her hand, who asked her father for her hand, whom she had seen like out and about, but didn't have a relationship with at all, wasn't allowed to date, right? And her sister was married to like the town school teacher, who was 20 some years older. Her sister when she was 16, right? Her mother was also given by her father, to like the man who became the town priest when she was, I forget, like 17, right? So this is, all of the women as far back as I know, and I know many generations because we all come from the same spot on the island of Lesbos, had no education, were not allowed education. They all went to some, up to like third grade in elementary school, and then you had to focus on like the homemaking. So that's how it went all along. My mom was allowed to graduate high school, which was unique. She actually was allowed to go to the capital of the island and graduate high school, but then couldn't continue. She wanted to be a school teacher. No, Mary. So her life was determined, and she cried and cried. She never made a choice again in her life. Her life was determined by her father and then her husband. And that's the lot, like that's what was familiar to her. So even though this is the 70s now, the 60s had happened, like, they had seen women in miniskirts. those customs stayed unchanged. So
Yes.
within, like in my case, one generation, but let's say in more, in more like modernized Western societies, maybe it's 2 generations, maybe it's 3 generations, but that's about it.
Yes.
In the span of like a very short amount of time, what had been, thousands of years of oppression, of non-personhood, of not being allowed to like own property, of not being allowed to own your children, of being considered legally a vessel, right? Owned by
Yes.
your father and then by your husband, whose names you took. From that, women suddenly kind of like were allowed, more or less equal rights as men. So
Yes.
what's unique in our place is that it's such a short time of change, and so much has gone on. Like, it's not
Yes.
just that women could like go get jobs, but also all the changes in reproductive health. So you
Yes.
could also like freeze your eggs and get IVF babies and have birth control and have paternity tests, which was like the ultimate control. The ultimate reason for controlling the women like this was that there was no other way to guarantee paternity, and all of patriarchy is based on this knowledge of paternity. It's based on like
Yes.
the reversal of what's natural, which is the maternal lineage, and on like taking over the obvious lineage that nature intended, which is the mother, has the child, looks after the child, passes on the child, gets the good and the bad of the child, the wealth that the child represents, right? And instead,
Yes.
like patriarchy, usurped that and made the uterus of the woman the property of another, which is
Yes.
enslavement.
Yes.
So all of this changed, like literally after World War II, at a time when already, humanity was at like an existential crisis, because people saw that their leaders were so insane that they could, and had developed such powerful weapons that they could basically destroy, the human race, like the species, off the face of the earth. That was something that had never occurred to anyone before. So I think the combination of those, of those things, of like the technological changes and also the kind of philosophical changes. Where is God? Like, where is the power of God when man has this insane power, of like nuclear weapons, right? When man can interfere with the most, fundamental power of nature, which is reproduction, right? So all of that happened in a generation. So my daughter, who is now 24, has never not known like women being so-called equals. She has grown up taking it for granted. She has grown up taking all these reproductive choices for granted. To her, it's the most, like to her, it's kind of exotic to be a trad wife. That's how quickly this change has happened. But it's not an actual change. It's like window shop, right? It's like an outside change, because we don't look into the reasons for it, and we don't try to understand what has happened, in a way that everyone is familiar with, in a way that like it becomes part of like a common knowledge. So I compare this time, this kind of like extraordinary time of change for women, for gender in general, but particularly women, to the time when matriarchy became patriarchy. It's a similar huge shift, right? And it takes about, at least like 50, 80 years, maybe even a century. It's not something that happens overnight. But in ancient time, Lesbos is the island of Sappho, right? So Even at the time of Sappho, women were less oppressed than they were at the time of my grandparents. So it was still, it was still closer to the era of matriarchy than, 19 whatever 20s, right? The beginning of the 20th century, same place. So what basically changed was the beginning of the, what they call agricultural revolution. And then, it started with climate becoming easier, more temperate. So the nomadic, human tribes were able to kind of settle for longer near bodies of water at places with good climate instead of chasing climate, chasing like places where they could survive, where there would be growth in the trees and they could, live in the trees and hunt and gather and whatever, and then bad weather would come and they would move again, right? So once the weather got better, so much better, they settled down in places where they slowly became more and more organized. That organization was still matriarchal because the gardening, the domesticating of animals was still like, matriarchy, the women's work. So around that time, we have consciousness, around the time, like consciousness as we understand it now happens, right, begins. And with consciousness, consciousness starts with a consciousness of our own mortality. And then at some point, it moves into consciousness of parentage, of lineage. So I think that women already instinctively had a sense of who was the father of each child, but there was no knowledge. There could be no knowledge because, a woman could have like 20 partners within one monthly cycle. So only by kind of remembering and seeing similarities, genetic similarities, and making connections that were more magical than logical in her head, did she have like a kind of intuitive sense, a magical sense of fatherhood. At some point of that consciousness, of development of consciousness, men, I think women pass to men the knowledge, probably to their sons first, the knowledge that it's really one man, one womb. And in my opinion, like that's the beginning, the revolutionary start of what becomes the patriarchy.
Well, what time period are you referring to? Like, are you referring to like
to
pre-human?
No, 10,000.
Pre-human ancestors?
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, I'm referring to before Homo sapiens took over completely. So we still have like Neanderthals and other parts, but it's the beginning of the agricultural era. So let's say, 10,000 years ago to 11,000. No.
Ancient Sumeria.
Yeah, before ancient Sumeria. So before any writing that we can decipher for sure, and before official, ruins that represent like cities with strong construction or palace, what we call now palace, or kingly structures or anything like that. So we're
like
still in the
the
Paleolithic era, basically, where there are homes and they are together, but they're built with, earth, like adobe, right? And the tools are very, what we would call, primitive. But there is fire, there is domestication, and there is gardening, and there is the beginning of like realizing we can stay here and maybe like die here. And once you start dying in the same place, that's where mortality becomes clear. And once you're in the same place, that's when paternity becomes more clear. And then, because you're looking at each other all the time, much more than you're looking outside at like the enemies, at the predators that you must escape, right? So the survival level kind of like tones down a little, and this new kind of knowledge, our brain is absorbing this new kind of knowledge because we're at close, stable quarters with each other. So this new agricultural stability is really responsible for the knowledge in revolution, and and the huge kind of like revolution in civilization that becomes the patriarchy.
Anthropology defines a civilization as when the work of one person via agriculture can feed 100 people. So then that frees up the other 99 people to begin to like specialize in other crafts. So that's like what you're talking about.
So we haven't got to that place yet.
We're not there yet.
To that. No, we're pre-civilized, so to speak.
Okay.
It is specifically in my opinion, it is specifically the effort of patriarchy that is the instigator, the impetus, the motivator for all of these, kind of like pretty brilliant reorganizations. So,
it's interesting that you say that, because I always, so with my anthropological background, like I always thought about it from a different perspective, which is that when there is a way to, like, in these matriarchal, matrilineal, usually like seasonally nomadic communities that you're talking about, like the proto-human community, pre-agrarian, there's no way to store wealth from season to season. So it's like the wealth of the community is the same as the wealth of the individual. It's completely inexorable.
Right.
But when you start having a way, and especially like a lot of the foodstuffs that humans were consuming were not able to be stored, right? Because you're like getting tubers, nuts, fruits, like maybe nuts can be stored or whatever over, but you're not like,
well, you can store and preserve stuff, and women
you can store and preserve it,
did that.
but you're not gonna, and it's not out of the question that maybe people were doing that and storing things for the next year at their seasonal camps when they're still living nomadic lives. Right. But it's like, if you're living a nomadic lifestyle, you're not storing things. You're more living in the moment, I guess, and not to say that, pre-agrarian societies didn't practice like agriculture, because they did practice like
exactly.
like horticulture, more like things that can grow and be harvested within one season. Anyway, but so once you have grain, which can be stored, and the reason why grain was like so successful in the Indus River Valley and into, like between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as well, is because you have house cats evolving in that same part of the world, hunting the rodents, helping people store the grain. But so once you can store wealth in the form of grain, and once you have a society where you need to redistribute wealth, then you get these systems of hegemony that it's like, okay, well, you grow the grain, I collect it, then I redistribute it. And so that's kind of where those like social stratifications come in, just like from the perspective of my degree.
That's the perspective that we're taught. That's what we're taught. So,
but if you are, so what I was taught is that kind of comes around the same time as people or men wanting to pass wealth down the male line, so that it's kind of like the dawn of monoculture, this is what I'm trying to, and patriarchy kind of come together.
This is what I'm pinpointing. Exactly. It's that, the way that we're taught it is like, and coincidentally, but there's never been a clear explanation. So the way I see it is the way that, like, using like the Marxist understanding of, the view of history, but instead of economic relations, I'm using procreative relations. So my understanding is that, the story of history, as we know it, is the story of the oppression of procreators by non-procreators. So those who cannot have children do oppress those who do. And by extension, because this is such an unnatural act that has to be passed through the generations as the most normal and natural act, there is it extends to the oppression of nature. So
Yes.
culture and civilization is designed to oppress nature, just like
Yes.
patriarchy is designed to oppress mothers.
Yes.
So, but to go back, what I think is the impetus from these like early agricultural settlements that exist already in the Paleolithic and early Neolithic era, and some, so depending on the part of the world, these dates can change. At that time, when man realizes that it's one man, one child, right? Then I think that man develops what, to put it simply in a Freudian term, it would be like womb envy, because mothers can give birth to like 5-10 children, and so they can distribute jobs to those children. They can those children like will help them later, and men kind of feel left out of that whole cycle. And that kind of like womb envy leads to the understanding of it's one man, one womb, and all that man needs to do is to keep become responsible for a womb, to kind of like rent a womb per man. One man rents one womb for life. So what does he rent it with, though? Like he needs to come up with a trade. He needs to come up with a bargain that this mother, or at least those who control the mother, mother at that time is a fertile female of the age of like 11, right, or 12, however, whenever they begin to menstruate. So the young virgin becomes one, the great trophy, right? How can I get a young virgin and keep her to myself so that her children, I have guarantee, are also my children for life? Because this is the only way that you have a sense, that you have a way to overcome your mortality, and you have a sense of kind of, continuation within this stable new society that's developing. So that's the motivation for everything else that happens. What can I give this woman or her, it's first the woman, then becomes her father, but what do I give, the woman or her parents that's worth her not having access to like the best men possible, right? Not getting like, like looking around for the mate who, a combination of whom would guarantee, the evolutionary future for her children, but instead commit herself procreatively only to me, right? So that's where inventiveness comes in. He has to come up with shit that wasn't available before, like big jars of grain. That will guarantee that your kids will live longer than the next guy's kids, or the woman's kids who still lives in the natural way and has not like, betrothed herself, right, to someone. So basically patriarchy is that one, a trade. And in time, it becomes very centrally controlled. But in the beginning, it's like man has to invent stuff, tools, weapons that can, protect better whoever decides to kind of like give her monogamy to him, right? So I still believe that in the beginning, fertile women have a lot of agency. And this becomes kind of like, men have to come up with these new kind of hacks that make them attractive in this stable society. When they were moving, they were most attractive when they were strong, when they were like survivors, and it was just kind of like come and go. But now that they're stable, if they are able to kind of like control more land or till more land or have enough like olive trees. I say this as a Greek, right? To have olive oil for 2 years in these clay jars. So that's how it begins. That's the first step. And then you get to the step where men trades with other men because they end up having even more than they need for that family. And once they start trading with each other, that's where you get to the competition, right? Of like who has more. And step by step, you get, more and more kind of like centrally controlled organization of like clans and families, and to get to the place where there's a hierarchy with a king and what you were saying, which is specialization of labor. Like, okay, you be soldiers, you be craftsmen, you be farmers. But in order to get to that stage, you need to invent the symbolic exchange means, which is money, right? Gold or whatever you agree. In the beginning, it could be like precious stones or seashells. It doesn't matter. The point is, there has to be an agreed form of like exchange of value. And by the time you get to the, to the invention of money, women are already outside that. They don't have a place in that. That by the time that happens, women are already owned. They are already bought and bartered. They are, it happens in enough time later that women don't have legitimate access to wealth unless they're given it by their husbands or by their fathers, whoever keeps them. So they keep, that's why they become the breeders. And there are exceptions, if their father is very powerful and wealthy, maybe the daughter will become like a queen or whatever. There is still some power left in women because there's a lot of the ancient magical knowledge that's passed down. But basically the social tools of like language, money, and then in time law exclude women. And that's how we find ourselves here, thousands, like 7,000, 8,000, depending, years later. Women still don't have generational wealth. There is no comparison to where men stand, in this culture. And I can unpack the effect of like the different currencies, because that's a huge effect. But and the reason that women have been so-called freed from that state is only because science resolved the need for patriarchy. When anybody can get a cheap paternity test, like it's not cost effective for men to hold one woman only with her children and pay for her, right? Like, why? It's obsolete. And that's why now we have like same-sex marriage, and we have this. It doesn't matter. You have surrogates. The whole setup is obsolete. So in a sense, like patriarchy contained the tools to its own destruction, right? Because its ultimate goal was to take from nature, to break the secret, that only women had, to break the secret of nature. And it did, and by doing that, it dissolved. It had no longer reason to exist. And all of a sudden, we're in the Industrial Revolution, and, money becomes meaning. Like all the stuff the patriarchy had set up through civilization for, to represent meaning and faith and value, which was how it was kind of controlling the minds and the psyches of millions and millions of people through all of these hundreds of generations, right? So they didn't all constantly rebel against this kind of like artificial setup. All of that became unnecessary. So civilization as we knew it became unnecessary. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. In my opinion, it has extraordinary value, but it became unnecessary for the system. So everything turned into the one thing that was left, which is money. So the one thing that has survived out of the patriarchy is this huge amount of wealth, which is patrilineal wealth. So the stuff that survives at all costs is patrilineage, right? So that's why, for example, we're still arguing about abortion. No one gives a shit about abortion, you know? It's about
it's
paternity.
the control.
Exactly. Yep. It's about if you give up if you give up the father's ownership of the new human, so to speak, then that whole passage of money, which is the only thing that keeps the system now going, will no longer make sense. And then what? We don't have an alternative. So that's where the need for an alternative comes in.
Fascinating. Okay.